Okay, let's get started. So we have Alex Matchneer coming from New York, and he was doing a talk about this system where he had to synchronize in real time and figure it out how the different information was in sync. And I guess we get a lot of feedback from that talk, and we want to cover some of the questions that may have risen during that time, and also if you have other questions that you want to ask him. Let's start with like what do you think have been the most challenging times to implement this type of system?
I think a lot of it has to do with not being able to really look anywhere for advice, because the only app that seemed to do the same kind of thing was Uber, and at the time they didn't really have they didn't really share how they were building these things. And on top of that, I had a lot of experience working on Ember and working on like the router and how it parses URLs, and so my mindset for how to tackle these problems was very geared toward keeping the constraints of clicking around in a browser in mind. And I think having these like deeply ingrained patterns for how I build things, it was really hard to like pull away from that and rethink the specific problem. So just as a reminder, the problem is you have two different kinds of apps. Take the Uber example of passenger and driver, and they need to keep in sync with each other in order for the product to work, in order for passengers to find drivers and whatnot. If anything breaks down in their connections to the server, or their app code is written poorly or has a bug that doesn't follow what the server tells it is its state, then the whole thing kind of breaks down. So in our case, we've got shoppers that need to be in sync with the in-store merchant app as they're walking around grocery stores and scanning. And keeping those apps in sync and kind of knowing how to write code that felt clean and was kind of consistent across the code bases was very difficult.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of innovation in that space. And I can imagine, it can get pretty tough when, the competitor is adding new features and you maybe are still stabilizing some of the code that you have released. I mean, this seems like a challenging development.
Sure. Well, I got a handful of ideas of who the competitors are. I know some of them have kind of like fallen away, and some of them kind of approach the product differently, so that they haven't had to solve the same problems as us. So I can't even, it's hard even to look to them as like, oh, they did it this clever way. Okay, now I'm going to adapt. It's all kind of feeling my way around the dark. And
maybe you want to give like a little intro. So maybe for the people that maybe are joining just now, so what is the app? What is basically the main features, and kind of a nice intro for the people to join the conversation?
Sure. It might actually be easier if I jump to the laptop for a second. Sure. There's 2 slides from the talk yesterday that kind of reintroduce it pretty well. So these are showing up all right. So this is mobile checkout. And this is an app that we built that's kind of white labelable. So different companies have bought this, and it's been branded to them and put to the upload to the App Store and Play Store. And it's built with Ember and Cordova, so not React Native like I think a lot of people here are using. And the idea is that you open the app and you geolocate, it finds the nearest store. You say that you're going to start shopping, and then you can start pulling items off the shelf and scanning it and seeing the prices live calculated with real prices and from their database with taxation and coupons and all the complicated corner cases. And then you sort of review your purchase, you check out, and 90% of the time you just walk out of the store, and every so often you have to do a security check. And this is a little video demo of pulling some gummy bears off the wall, scanning it, and having it, I could probably position this a little bit better. Well, anyway, I'll show it one more time. So pulling some Haribo gummy bears off the wall, putting the barcode in there, it scans it, adds it to the cart, and then you can sort of review the purchase you're about to make. And I recorded that on my phone at the live store, the Fairway Market store in New York City. It's really nice to be able to use your own product, 2 blocks away from where you work. And this is kind of where we're at. So that's a basic introduction of what we've had to build. What it doesn't show about the real-time thing is that there's also a merchant app that's like the cashiers are using, and they can see everybody that's scanning gummy bears and seeing like how they're building up their carts. And if they have to do this security check, they're going to get alerted to come over and like double check the bag and say good to go. And that's the most complicated and most sensitive part of this whole product. That stage, that sort of like nail-bitey stage of like, like they actually have to do some stuff and everything needs to work and no one can have a connection outage. It's like, it's risky.
Yeah, that seems quite complicated.
Yeah.
But thanks for the intro.
Sure.
We'll take some of the questions. Let's see what we have. So, what can you tell us about the server-side architecture? So
I can tell you a little bit about where we are now and where we are headed. So we're kind of finishing up some of the realizations for how to better architect the client side, which includes everything I presented on. And I mentioned in the talk that server side is definitely its own component. Where we are now is that we have a kind of messy approach where when we can send the payload updates of like purchase just changes, we can send the whole thing, and other times we're just sending some information that this has changed and it's just a queue to all connected clients to just like hit some AJAX requests and pull the latest data. Those work, but I feel, so specifically we're using Rails and we're using ActionCable, which has been around since Rails 5, and we waited a little bit for it to kind of settle before we took it in because Rails is already, I think, on 6 at this point. But we're using that so that our Rails servers directly can maintain this persistent connection, and we're hosting over Heroku, which has had WebSocket support for a few years now. What we are planning to move to is something like Firebase. So Firebase is, I think, probably the easiest, but also pretty robust real-time database that you can use. It's got a very simple model where your entire database is just a giant JSON blob, and you can subscribe to sort of subtrees of that, and the subtrees can have their different rules for who's allowed to read it and write to it. And I almost wish I had made a diagram for this, but what we're heading to and what I can recommend for people, there's a lot of ways to use Firebase incorrectly. What I would recommend is an approach where you have your server that publishes all of the changes to Firebase and treats Firebase as kind of a like real-time read-only replica of your Postgres or whatever database that you're using on your server that you've already built up at this point. Publish all your changes to Firebase and then have all of your clients just read only and just subscribe to updates from Firebase. It's kind of got this unidirectional circular flow to it, and it's, in contrast, it's to how I think a lot of people think they want to use Firebase at first, which is have all the clients like read and write to it. But there's things that you need to be able to do that Firebase is not very good at, such as transactions. Our app has to deal with money changing hands and walking out of stores with physical goods, so we can't have anything where the merchant and the shopper are like writing to the same thing and saying like subtract $30 from this thing. That's not really a good way to use Firebase. So that is what we are, the sort of circular Firebase as a read-only replica of our Postgres server is kind of where we're heading. And the only difference is that we actually need to offer our product as a self-hostable solution, and Firebase, as far as I know, is only something that's on the cloud that you have to pay for. And so we are not actually going to specifically use Firebase, but we are probably going to build our own similar thing where it's just take all the stuff that we currently have in Rails that like writes to ActionCable, take that out of there, and have a separate server maintain the WebSocket connection so that all Rails has to do is kind of have this request response style format where it validates the data you're sending to it, does all the sort of low-level Postgres transactions to make sure you're safe, and then when everything's done, publish to Firebase and let it do its job. That's where things are going. We're not there yet, but that is kind of, if you're solving similar kinds of problems, I definitely recommend that approach for server-side.
Thinking about the architecture that you were mentioning, what is the scale that you are dealing with, like of notifications or messages? Just
we're
curious.
certainly not having to deal with the kinds of problems of Uber. Those would be nice problems to have, but all the decisions that we're making are kind of predicting the future because things are looking pretty good at the moment. Where we're deployed are doing well, and we're kind of integrating more stores and opening up in more places. So I don't know exactly how to quantify it, but we're not at a scale where we're getting we're running up against like massive performance issues, but we don't want to build, we don't really feel great about continuing to build on ActionCable. Some of that is not just like network traffic scale, but also just like dealing with the corner cases, connection loss, keeping track of missed messages that you still need to send to the client. It's a whole category of problems that's like gets messier and uglier to deal with as more people start to use it. And so we're trying to get off the system where our Rails side has to kind of handle that sensitive subscription stuff as soon as possible. Put it onto something like very simple, but good at handling that problem, such as a Firebase-ish thing.
Cool. Let's see if we have any questions here from the people here. No? Okay, I'll take another one from Sliggoo. Oh, okay.
Since you're talking about server implementation, in your talk you mentioned something about the server knowing the state of the client, to know what data to send. Does that mean that you cannot have stateless server implementation? How do you deal with sessions? How do you deal with scalability? That kind of stuff?
Is the main part of the question about like what are the implications on like stateless servers?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just picked a couple of words from your talk, so I don't even know if that makes sense. But I think you talked about having a session and then the server knowing what data your client is supposed to show. So does that mean that you're have a stateful session on your server? Because normally that's
An anti-pattern?
well, you know.
Well, it's the hardest part if you have to have that kind of state.
Yeah. So is that a problem you're facing?
Do we have to repeat the questions because I'm not sure what.
Yeah, if you want.
Oh, great. Sure. Let me just read it one more time. Okay. So the idea, I mentioned yesterday that you have a sort of shopping session or your purchase state, and that's just like something that lives in the database. Like while that session is active, you can look in Postgres and pull that off there and see like state equals in cart or whatever. That is a kind of logical session. As far as the like session of an active like WebSocket connection to our server, that's a different kind of session, and that's the kind of stuff that I want to offload to something like Firebase that's good at just like if we have to have a connection to the server that's stateful. I mean, by stateful I mean like the server needs to know what it's already sent to that client, needs to know what it's acknowledged, all these like little things. That I would love to encapsulate that in a separate system where that doesn't have to encumber our main Rails setup, because that stuff gets pretty ugly. And again, I can't mention so much about like what is the limit before it starts to not scale. I just know that I would like to take some of the ugliness out of our main part of the code base and just put it on the thing that's good at keeping things in sync with the server, and that would be Firebase or whatever is your Firebase-like component to your real-time server architecture.
Awesome. I think the next question we can leave it for later.
You can ask it if you want.
It's a little bit unrelated.
Okay.
But I like to point to the second one. So how is the performance by using Cordova?
I would say that there are apps where you would not be able to build the app in Cordova and be happy with the performance, but our app does not really hit those pain points. And I showed you that example with the scanning the gummy bears off the wall and then having it show up in your cart. So what's happening there is that, just as a reminder, so Cordova is the technology that takes a mobile app that you've built using web technology with your favorite JS framework. We use Ember, you could use it with React, and then it basically packages that up into an iOS app and Android app that are both like viewing your app through a web view. It's not going to be as performant, and there's definitely going to be some corner cases where you might prefer something like React Native. But already from that demo, you can see that was a web view with a transparent background over a native camera view. And for the most part, that works just fine. I think there's a handful of screens where I'm just like, this is a little clunky. But We never have anything with like a screen that's just got hundreds and hundreds of items where you're scrolling through it and you have to think of clever ways to avoid like rendering too many list items at the same time. Some of those things might be more problematic if you're just using Cordova and rendering rendering just a huge screen with lots of nesting and all this stuff, but it hasn't really been a problem for our kind of app. So I would say get an understanding of what you have to render in your app and try and imagine the worst case and then see whether something like Cordova would be fine or whether you just want to use React Native, which obviously makes tons of sense too.
You were mentioning when we were preparing for the session that you had some issue. Is this somewhat related to this conversation, or?
Do you remember some issue regarding
integration with the native platform?
Oh, I would just say that I think we were talking about. Oh, right. Just if you go down the Cordova route, Cordova's got a whole like community of plugins that some are well maintained, and some are just these like plugins that someone threw out there. I mean, it's like this sort of common JavaScript problem that someone has probably written the module that you're looking for, but it's really hard to tell whether there's any sort of community like consensus around this being the way to go. And sometimes it's that way with Cordova plugins, and that means sometimes you have to really get your hands dirty and fix some like low-level iOS or Android bug. And so just an example of the kind of things that I have to maintain using Cordova is that we got a variety of these barcode scanner libraries that we have to integrate with, and one of them had an issue with how it was kind of like a multi-threaded issue, where it's taking frames from the camera and trying not to overload the portion of the CPU that's like scanning for barcodes. And there's an issue where the queue is getting filled up with a bunch of stale frames and causing issues in some cases. So if you go down this route, I mean, this would be true with React Native as well, but there's definitely some times where you really have to know Java on the Android side, or Swift or Objective-C on the iOS side to maintain a product like this.
Were you able to fix it?
Yeah, I fixed it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I feel like I got lucky, but.
Then it may feel confusing, but then if you can fix it, then it's also a great challenge.
Yeah, the solution was to put a bunch of console logs everywhere.
Of course. I mean, when you were mentioning these different qualities on these plugins, I mean, it feels more like JavaScript. I mean, have you used JavaScript, like micro libraries and the different sets of quality around the board of different options? You need to do some research, try to find the one that will work for you, but then sometimes you need to work around the issues of the particular library. Yeah. I mean, it's good that you can find some sort of solution, even if it's not 100%. Well,
sometimes it's like you can find the library and it doesn't really help you that somebody made it. All it does is validate that someone's run into a problem they've sort of tried to solve, but who knows if it's really your exact use case. So it validates that your problems are real, but not necessarily
hit and miss. Solved. Hit and miss. Let's pick another question, and we still have room for more. So which is the better use of WebSockets? So between WebSockets or push notifications, which one of them you think you can combine for different cases?
Just to be clear, so push notifications refers to, I'm going to assume it means the sort of native supported thing where like if your app's not even active, you'll see something from iOS or Android in the top bar that some messages come through. Temporarily, we're not actually using push notifications for anything, but we are going to be bringing it back shortly. So for something that needs to keep in sync, you really want a persistent connection. So there's kind of this, push notifications are very much like an event-based system, like fire an event and hope and expect iOS to actually deliver it to your system. And you can use event-driven systems to solve the how do I keep data in sync, but ultimately the end goal is whatever value, however you get the information, I want this piece of data that I have to be the latest version of what this has. And sometimes an event can fail to deliver, and in that case, you need some other mechanisms to just be why haven't I heard from you for a while? Maybe I'm gonna kill this connection and get another thing. And so this comparison of WebSocket versus push notifications, I'm not really sure how you'd really robustly solve the syncing problem with just push notifications. You're going to want to use WebSockets, and in the course of one user using the app, you might have a few different connections that you disconnect or reconnect over time to really make sure that you're getting the latest. One case that there's no other option than to use push notifications is, so one of the integrations we did is for Colruyt Group, which is a sort of a conglomerate that maintains a bunch of different stores. And so one of our apps is the Scan Pay Go app that is live in Belgium for a few Spar and OK stores. And the only payment option that really worked for Belgian users was this bank contact app, where you have to leave our app so you can finish paying in this app that apparently everybody just has there. But at the end of it, depending on whether you're using your banking app or your bank contact app, it might not redirect back to our app. And so the only solution to make sure that they got something that they can tap to go back and finish the process is to fire a push notification. And so that will be our controlled little snippet of UI that we can actually display over someone else's app to fix that problem. But generally speaking, if you're staying in your app and you need to keep in sync, you want something like WebSockets as your live connection.
I guess it will depend on how much reliable and how much it can cover, the feature that you actually want to implement. But for some cases, you really want to know that the client has received the notification.
For sure. And the thing I mentioned yesterday, might have seemed arbitrary at the time, but I kind of tried to decide these or define these 3 different degrees of real time, because if you just need something to be better than a button that you have to manually refresh, then you can probably use push notifications, just be stuff changed, get the latest, and if it fails to deliver, it's not going to break your product. But beyond that, there's more involved degrees of real time where you want something more like WebSockets to have a better guarantee that things are in sync.
Awesome. So we will pick the last one, and then we will do some kind of wrap up.
Sure.
For this one is, did adding real time to an existing mobile app bring some high battery consumption issues that in your experience?
Not compared to having a camera view behind your web view. That was the worst part, and still is. So it's not like we started out with a version of the app that didn't have a camera and didn't have real time. It's had to be that way from the beginning. But I think we would consider the impact on battery if our app had to be alive in the background. Some apps just are constantly monitoring your location or constantly monitoring for updates, and there are ways that you can make poor use of network connections to always turn on the signal connection. But in our case, the app is probably going to use your battery for the 5 minutes that you're shopping, and then you turn it off and you're done. It's not a huge problem that we try to solve, though lately I guess we have tried to come up with solutions when you start off low on battery. How can we still make sure that you'll get through the process?
Awesome. Well, that was our AMA. We, of course, recommend you to contact him after the session. There's still maybe a couple of hours that maybe they can reach you easily. And otherwise, feel free to write more questions on the Sliggoo app.
I love all these questions. I'm sad I can't answer all of them.
Maybe if you are here and you wrote these questions, maybe you can try to get an answer from him right here, right now.
Sounds good.
Well, thanks again for joining this session and answering all these questions.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's all.
Great.
Cheers.